Have you ever walked into a room and felt like your presence didn't matter? Like you were just there, not welcomed, not celebrated, not even really seen? Maybe you smiled first, started the conversation, asked all the questions, filled every silence, and yet something inside you whispered, "I don't belong here anymore." If that sounds familiar, you're not alone. It's one of the hardest truths to face, especially later in life. After all you've given, years of love, sacrifice, patience, it hurts to realize that some people, even family, have stopped truly seeing you. They may still invite you over. They may still answer your calls. But the warmth has faded. The connection feels shallow. And the saddest part? You keep showing up, hoping one day they'll notice, hoping one day they'll care the way they used to. But my friend, let me gently ask you, how many more times will you knock on a door that only opens out of obligation? How many more conversations will you try to keep alive while they glance at the clock or scroll through their phone? How long will you keep giving when all that's left for you is silence? We've been taught, especially in our generation, that family is everything. That love means giving without expecting. That you should hold on, no matter what. And while there's beauty in loyalty and resilience, there's also a quiet danger. Because sometimes in trying to be the good parent, the understanding grandparent, or the patient sibling, we end up slowly disappearing from our own lives. That's why today I want to talk with you about something most people avoid: walking away from those who no longer respect you, even if they're family. Not to be cruel, not to cut ties out of anger, but because your time, your presence, and your peace are far too precious to keep offering to people who don't value them. Let me share a story with you. It's one I hear often. A woman in her 70s told me she visits her daughter's home every Sunday, just like she's always done. She brings dessert, helps clean up, plays with the grandchildren. But lately, no one really talks to her. The kids are busy. Her daughter is stressed. Her son-in-law barely looks up. She sits in the corner, smiling politely, but inside she feels invisible. When she gets home, she cries, not because they were unkind, but because they didn't seem to care if she was even there. She asks herself, "Is it me? Am I expecting too much?" No, dear heart, you're not expecting too much. You're asking for something very basic: to be seen, to be heard, to be respected. And if those things are absent, it's not love. It's routine, habit, guilt. And staying in that space, week after week, does something to your spirit. It tells you that your feelings don't matter, that being sidelined is just part of aging, that this is all you can hope for now. But I'm here to tell you something else. You have every right to protect your peace, even from your own children, even from your siblings, even from people you've known and loved for decades. Because respect is not guaranteed by blood, it's earned through behavior. Too often we confuse patience with silence. We let things slide because we don't want to be a burden. We downplay our sadness because we don't want to make things awkward. But ask yourself, how long can you keep swallowing that ache before it becomes bitterness? How many times will you excuse their distance before you start questioning your own worth? This is not about cutting people off. It's about choosing yourself. About saying, "I will not keep shrinking to fit into someone else's limited affection." Because you were not made to be tolerated, you were made to be loved. Let's talk about what respect really looks like. It's not about grand gestures or fancy words. It's about effort, eye contact, a message that says, "I'm thinking of you." A visit that feels like a choice, not a chore. A voice that lights up when it hears yours on the other end of the line. And if those things have disappeared, not just once but again and again, it's okay to step back. Not to punish them, but to heal yourself. Stepping back doesn't mean you don't love them. It means you love yourself enough to stop chasing crumbs of attention. You're allowed to choose peace over pain. You're allowed to say, I miss who we used to be, but I won't keep hurting just to stay close. Now, I know some people will say, but what if they come around? What if they're just busy? What if I wait a little longer? That's a fair question. And sometimes people do change. But let me ask you this. What is the cost of waiting? How many months or years will you give away, hoping they'll wake up and suddenly see your worth? And in that time, how much of you do you lose? You don't get to relive your 60s or 70s or 80s. You have this one moment, this one life, to fill with meaning. And if someone is consistently showing you that you're not a priority, it's time to stop making them yours. You are not a background character in someone else's story. You are the author of your own life. You get to choose where your energy goes. And sometimes, the bravest, kindest thing you can do is to lovingly step back and say, I will not keep showing up where I am no longer seen. Think of it this way. If you plant a flower in soil that refuses to nourish it, no matter how much you water it, it will wither. That doesn't mean the flower is weak. It just means the environment is wrong. So instead of blaming yourself for not blooming, maybe it's time to replant. Somewhere with warmth, light, and care. And yes, that might mean fewer visits, fewer phone calls, more quiet afternoons spent doing things that bring you joy. Reading, walking, learning something new, meeting people who lift you up instead of draining you. It may be uncomfortable at first, but over time, that space you created by letting go of what hurt you becomes room for something better. You are not here to beg for attention. You are not here to earn love through suffering. You are here to be respected, cherished, and free. And the moment you stop giving your energy to those who can't appreciate it is the moment you begin to reclaim your power. You might be wondering, if I create distance, what will happen? Will they notice? Will they care? Will I feel even more alone? And those are important questions, because the answer isn't always what we want to hear. Sometimes they won't notice. Sometimes they'll go on as if nothing changed. And that can hurt more than any harsh word. But that pain, as sharp as it is, also tells you the truth you've been avoiding. Because when someone doesn't reach out, when your absence feels lighter than your presence, you haven't lost a relationship, you've lost an illusion. And that realization can be heartbreaking, yes. But it can also be freeing. You don't have to stay where you're merely tolerated. You don't have to chase after people who've stopped meeting you halfway. Love that only flows one way eventually runs dry. And the longer you pour from your cup without being refilled, the more empty you become. This isn't about becoming bitter or cold. It's about becoming wise. Knowing when to hold on and when to release. Knowing that walking away doesn't mean you've failed, it means you've grown. Have you ever watched a child lose interest in a toy? At first, they carry it everywhere. But over time, it gets tossed aside. Not because it lost value, but because the child took its presence for granted. That's how some people treat relationships too. They expect you to always be there, to always say yes, to always understand. And slowly, your consistency becomes invisible. But what happens when the toy goes missing? What happens when they look for it and it's not there? That's when they remember. That's when they ask questions. That's when they realize it had meaning after all. It's not about playing games or testing loyalty. It's about letting others feel your absence. Because if someone truly values you, they will notice when you step away. They will feel the quiet where your voice used to be. And if they don't, that silence speaks volumes. There's a kind of dignity that grows when you stop knocking on closed doors. When you stop asking for the bare minimum from people who have so much more to give and choose not to. You begin to remember who you are outside of the roles you've played for so long. Outside of being the giver, the helper, the peacekeeper, And in that remembering, something powerful happens. You begin to ask new questions. What do I want for myself now? What makes me feel alive? Who do I want around me? Not out of duty, but out of joy. It's never too late to build a different kind of life. One where your presence is appreciated, not assumed. Where your time is invested in people and places that bring you peace. Where you don't have to keep proving that you matter, because you've already decided that you do. There's a quote I love: "You don't have to set yourself on fire to keep others warm." And yet so many of us have done exactly that. We've burned through our patience, our time, our health, all to keep relationships alive that give little back. But love shouldn't leave you exhausted. It shouldn't make you feel smaller. Real love nourishes. It uplifts. It gives as much as it receives. So if you find yourself always being the one to initiate, to remind, to fix, pause. Ask yourself, what would happen if I stopped? If I stopped calling first? If I stopped visiting just to feel unwanted? If I stopped bending myself to fit into their schedule, their convenience, their world? Would they reach out? Would they miss you? Or would they simply continue unaffected? Either way, the truth is revealed. And that truth is a gift, even if it hurts. Because once you stop chasing what ignores you, you make room for what truly sees you. Some of the most meaningful relationships you'll have in this stage of life may come from unexpected places. A neighbor who checks in, a friend you meet in a class or a book club, a community that welcomes you for who you are today, not just for who you used to be. But to receive those new blessings, you need space. Emotional space. Mental space. And sometimes, that means stepping back from the people who once meant the most to you, because holding on is no longer healing you. I want to be clear. This doesn't mean cutting ties completely. For some, a little distance is all it takes to restore balance. Space can bring clarity. It gives others a chance to reflect too. But even if nothing changes on their end, something changes in you. You stop waiting. You stop hoping for someone else to define your worth. You start choosing yourself. And that choice transforms everything. You are not selfish for wanting respect. You are not cold for needing reciprocity. You are not dramatic for stepping away from what hurts. You are human. And you are worthy of relationships that honor your presence, not just use it. So as you sit with these thoughts, I invite you to be honest with yourself. Not with guilt, not with fear, but with compassion. What would it feel like to no longer beg for love that's gone quiet? To no longer put your life on pause for people who won't press play for you? You have a right to peace, to joy, to laughter that doesn't come with tension, to conversations where your voice isn't talked over or tuned out. You deserve to walk into a room and feel wanted, not just needed. There's a difference. One lifts you, the other drains you. And the beautiful truth is, you get to decide. You get to choose who walks beside you in this next season of life. You are not bound by the past. You are not obligated to keep playing a role that no longer fits. You are free, and freedom at this stage is one of the greatest gifts you can give yourself. So if today you feel like something's missing, not just in others, but in you, listen to that feeling. It's your soul asking for something deeper, something more honest, something kinder. And the first step to finding that something is often letting go of what no longer loves you well. There's something deeply empowering about realizing you don't need anyone's permission to live your life with dignity. For so long, you may have put others first, your children, your siblings, your spouse. You waited. You adjusted. You stayed quiet, thinking that if you just gave a little more, things would get better. But slowly, something inside you began to feel forgotten, not just by others, but by yourself. And that's where real change begins. When you finally say, no more. Not out of bitterness, not to punish anyone, but because you are done trying to earn what should have been offered freely. You're done bending until your back aches just to keep the peace. You're done confusing self-sacrifice with love, because love, true love, doesn't ask you to vanish. And yes, there may be people in your life who don't understand this shift. They'll say you've changed. They might accuse you of being cold or distant. They'll wonder why you've stopped calling, stopped visiting, stopped waiting. Let them wonder. Let them feel your absence. Because it's in that space, in that silence, where truth speaks the loudest. People often don't realize what they had until it's gone. Your voice, your presence, your energy, these things were never small. But when you're always available, always giving, always there, people can start to take it for granted. And it's only when you step back that they're forced to ask, where did they go? And here's the part no one tells you. That absence you create isn't just a message for them. It's a message for you. It says, I value my peace more than pleasing people who don't value me. It says, I choose my well-being over worn-out expectations. And the more you honor that truth, the lighter you become. Imagine waking up and not checking your phone for a message that never comes. Imagine walking through your day without wondering if someone will finally remember your birthday or return your call or invite you over. Imagine releasing that weight. Can you feel how freeing that would be? Because you don't need to be needed to be valuable. Your worth is not measured by how much you give. It's measured by how much of yourself you keep. And the truth is, if someone's love for you disappears the moment you stop doing for them, that was never love. That was convenience dressed up as care. There is power in choosing solitude over disrespect. There is peace in silence when it means you've stopped begging to be heard. And there is a quiet strength in saying, I deserve more than this. It might mean going for a walk without having to check in with someone who never checks in with you. It might mean saying no to a visit that drains you and yes to a quiet afternoon filled with music, nature, or even just your own thoughts. And in doing so, you send a message to the world. My time matters. My heart matters. I matter. We often fear that if we stop showing up, we'll be forgotten. But here's a powerful truth. If your absence makes no difference to someone, your presence never really mattered to them in the first place. And that's not a loss. That's a revelation. Because now you're free to invest in what truly brings you life. Whether it's a hobby you've put off for years, a new friendship, or simply reclaiming your mornings for coffee and peace instead of waiting and worry, you are allowed to live a life that makes you feel whole. And I want to be clear, choosing yourself isn't selfish. It's sacred. It's what keeps your soul alive. It's what sets an example for others, even your own children, of what it looks like to live with boundaries and grace. Because the truth is, people learn how to treat you based on what you allow. If you allow silence, they'll give it. If you allow disrespect, they'll repeat it. But if you draw a line, calmly, clearly, and say, this is where I stop giving without receiving, some people will step up. And those who don't, they were never standing beside you to begin with. You don't need loud goodbyes. You don't need final confrontations. You simply need a decision. A quiet, grounded decision that your peace is no longer up for compromise. So if you find yourself sitting alone, don't see it as a sign that something's wrong. See it as a chance to finally hear yourself again, to return to your own heart, to reconnect with the person you've always been, wise, kind, resilient, and whole. You've spent so much of your life caring for others. Now, it's time to care for you. Let the phone be silent. Let the door stay closed. Let the ones who never appreciated you wonder where you went. Because where you are now, right here, with yourself, that's where the healing begins. That's where life begins again. There's something beautiful about arriving at a point in your life where you stop needing to explain yourself. You don't owe anyone a speech about why you've pulled back, why you've chosen distance, why you've stopped calling. Your peace is explanation enough. Your quiet joy, your calmer heart, your lighter steps, they say more than words ever could. You've spent decades holding space for others, being the one they called when they needed help, the one who sacrificed sleep, money, time, even dreams for the people you love. And if you're being honest, there was always a part of you that hoped they would remember, that one day they'd look back and say, "I see now. I understand. Thank you." But sometimes that day never comes. Sometimes the people you poured into grow up or grow distant and never look back. And you're left standing in a quiet house, asking yourself if all of it mattered. Let me tell you something you may have forgotten along the way. It did. Your love mattered. Your presence mattered. Your patience, your effort, your devotion, they mattered. Even if no one ever said it out loud. Even if no one ever returned it. But now, it's your turn. Your turn to matter to yourself. Your turn to build a life that doesn't wait for recognition, but creates fulfillment. A life that isn't built around who might call or who might visit, but around what brings you joy, peace, and pride. You are not here to be remembered when convenient. You are here to be respected while you're still present. And respect, real respect, starts from within. It starts the moment you look at your reflection and say, "I don't have to chase love. I don't have to settle for crumbs. I don't have to prove my worth to anyone who can't see it." You may feel like you've lost time, like too many years were spent giving and waiting, hoping and hurting. But it's never too late to come home, not to a place, but to yourself. The self that remembers how to laugh freely. The self that still lights up when the sun hits the window just right. The self that hasn't disappeared, just got buried beneath other people's needs. And as you reclaim that self, you'll notice something quietly miraculous. The more you love your own company, the more your energy changes. The more you stop asking for space and start taking it, the more the right people begin to show up. Those who meet you with kindness, with effort, with genuine interest. Not out of guilt, not out of obligation, but because they want to. And if they don't, that's okay too. Because you've finally remembered the one person who's been with you through it all. You. The version of you who kept going through heartache, through loneliness, through disappointment. The version of you who's still here, still standing, still hoping, not for others to change, but for yourself to rise. You see, this isn't the end of your story. This is the chapter where you stop waiting and start writing. Where you realize that every day ahead can be filled with meaning, not because of who shows up, but because of how you show up. Not for others, for you. Maybe you'll start gardening again. Maybe you'll join a local class. Maybe you'll take those long walks without checking your phone, without waiting for a call that may never come. And slowly, day by day, you'll find that being alone is not something to fear. It's a gift, a space where you meet yourself again. And what you'll find is someone strong, compassionate, and full of life. There's a quote that says, "As is a tale, so is life. Not how long it is, but how good it is what matters." And your life, this part of it, can be good. Not because of who still remembers you, but because you remember your worth. So if today you feel a little sad, a little lost, let that be okay. Let it pass through you like a gentle wind. And then breathe, smile. Stand up slowly and remind yourself, you are no longer waiting. You are living. No more chasing after invitations that never come. No more wondering why your messages go unanswered. No more bending your life around the hope of someone else's attention. You're not a guest in other people's lives. You are the host of your own. And yes, Some people will never understand why you chose to take a step back. Let them misunderstand. Your peace is not up for debate. You don't need to be explained. You need to be honored. And if they can't do that, you walk away, not in anger, but in love. Love for yourself. It's time. Time to stop sacrificing your energy to empty spaces. Time to stop rehearsing conversations in your head, hoping next time it'll be different. Time to stop offering your heart to those who've stopped reaching out for it. Your life is no longer a waiting room. It's a home, and you get to decide who's allowed inside. So, take a breath. Feel the ground beneath you. You're still here. You still matter. And the years ahead, they can be some of the most freeing, the most peaceful, the most meaningful you've ever known. Because now, you're no longer trying to be invited. You're walking your own path. And for anyone watching this right now, if something inside you is saying, "This is me. I've felt this. I've lived this," then I want you to do something simple but powerful. Write in the comments, "My time matters." Add where you're watching from. Let it be a reminder to yourself and a light to others that your life, your presence, your worth do not depend on anyone else's behavior. Because when you stop trying to be chosen and choose yourself instead, you don't lose love. You finally find it. So here's to you, to your boundaries, to your strength, to your quiet courage, to the peace that comes when you say, "I am enough, just as I am, and I will no longer stay where I am not seen." If this message resonated with you, subscribe and stay with us. You've just begun a new chapter. And I promise, what comes next is not just survival. It's the life you've been waiting to claim. You didn't lose them. You found you. And that is everything.